It's December, and that can mean only one thing.
Invasion.
Of Polar Express, of course. Well, actually, we've been running Polar at the museum for about a month now, but obviously Christmas time is approaching, and what better way to think about Christmas time than the Polar Express, our very fun, now 20-year-old movie that documents a mystical train that runs to the North Pole. But we're train nerds here, and I've tried to do a full reaction video of the movie itself in the past, and that didn't work. So what I want to do is highlight a couple specific topics in Polar in a little mini-series here, seeing what would the real-world implications of trying to do what they did with the Polar Express be in the movie if you were actually a real train. What's up, guys? This is Heis, and we're gonna do some math today. Would the Polar Express have exploded by going down Glacier Gulch? Now, we know that if a steam locomotive's crown sheet in its firebox gets exposed for long enough, and the fire's hot enough, the crown sheet will fail, and the boiler will explode, and the locomotive and its crew will be no more. In Polar Express, there's a section of the movie where they go down Glacier Gulch, the steepest downhill grade, blah, 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 blah. It's very silly. And the signs say it's 179 degrees, so, you know, almost vertical. So, for all intents and purposes, straight down. So if they were carrying a normal water level and then tipped over like that, would the locomotive blow up? Well, that's what we're going to try and find out. So here you can see I've drawn basically a very simple version of what a typical steam locomotive boiler looks like. We have our firebox in here with a combustion chamber on a locomotive like the 1225, which is what the Polar Express locomotive is based off of, because 1225, that's Christmas Day if you use the United States date format. They were very funny. So it would have a combustion chamber, and then we have the tubes and flues that run up to the smoke box up ahead over here. And you can see that, you know, a normal operating water level is seen like this. We have our sight glass connected to the water space and then the steam space, and the reading in the glass corresponds with the level of the water inside the boiler. From the glass down to the crown sheet, which is the top of the firebox right here, you have to have at least 3 inches of space. So your water's got to drop down by more than 3 inches, and on some engines it's considerably more, before you expose that crown sheet. The fire in the firebox is hot enough that it can cause this steel to lose a lot of its strength and ultimately fail. So we're trying to determine if we go and rotate this choo-choo so it's facing almost straight down, how's the water going to react? Are we going to expose the whole crown, some of the crown, and how long is it going to be exposed? And that will tell us whether or not the choo-choo blows up. Now, the challenging part of this is that the water level is not going to be even to calculate as we transition. We can easily measure the water level using a sight glass on the real locomotive. However, the level of water surrounding the firebox, the volume of how much water that is versus the same amount of water, same level shown, up through the tube bundles can be very different, because this firebox is totally surrounded by water. So there's water on this side and then the far side as well. We're taking a little slice of the boiler here. And so you actually have to fill the boiler most of the way up to get this kind of reading. We'd usually estimate that the boiler is somewhere around 70 to 80% full of water if you're showing around this much in the glass. And that's a rough approximation, and it's one of those things that unless you know the exact geometry of the whole boiler, you can't know. So we're going to make some assumptions, because that's what we do as engineers. Make assumptions and then add a safety factor. Ding! So the assumption we're going to make is that the water level was such that when the locomotive tips, it exposes the whole crown sheet. That's going to be the worst case scenario. That's going to allow for the quickest heat transfer and the fastest heating of the steel if none of the crown sheet's being cooled. And with that, we should pretty well know, no matter what, whether or not the choo-choo would blow up. Now, for the sake of more assumptions, because that's kind of the only way to do this without having precise engineering drawings of the locomotive, and this is quite the silly endeavor anyways for a fictitious film with scary animated children, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that the crown sheet is the dimension of the grate area. The grate area is the area where the fire actually burns. We're going to assume we're getting heat transfer just to that area and see how quickly that heats up, compare it to how long the train was on the downhill. Bada bing, bada boom, maybe choo-choo go explode. Yeah, maybe bada boom. We don't know. So on the Pere Marquette 1225, which is the locomotive in question here, the great area, so the great area down here and the area that we're going to use for our crown calculations is 8.4 meters squared. And I know that we riff on imperial versus metric all the time on this channel. Last time we did absurd, stupid math for the train loop-to-loop, and we did it in imperial. Things got goofed up. Heat transfer's just easier in watts. BTUs per second, British thermal units? No, stupid. Let's use watts and everyone will be happy. For the rest of my fellow Americans, that is 90.3 square feet. So 8.4 square meters, 90.3 square feet. That is a huge firebox. That's basically almost double the great area of 491's firebox for those playing at home. Not quite double, but nearly double. So that's how much heat transfer we have. Now we need to figure out how hot the steel is, and then how hot the steel needs to be to fail. Assuming that they are trying to keep to the Mad Conductor's schedule here on the Polar Express, we know that they're going to be running the engine basically wide open as hot as they can. And so that means they're going to be running right up against the safety valves. This locomotive operates at 245 psi, which is some amount of bar, which will, the pressure rating is not important. But it's about 16 2/3 bar. Okay, so that's the pressure that this engine runs at, and at that pressure, the steam is going to be at 404 Fahrenheit, which is 206, or 207 basically, we'll simplify, degrees Celsius. So 404 Fahrenheit, 207 Celsius, all the steam and water mixed under pressure in this boiler is going to be that heat. And so that means that essentially, we can assume most conservatively that the exterior of the steel sheets is, and the steel sheets are thin enough that it's probably a slight temperature gradient, but we'll just assume that the steel sheets are at this temperature. So our crown sheet is at this temp. So what does it fail at? Well, it's hard to know exactly that. We do know from boiler explosions that have been studied that it took a long time for them to explode. The water levels were typically found something like 9, 10, 11 inches below the crown when the boiler exploded. You could see that from the wreckage that the safety inspectors were able to determine it. So you know that, okay, it's got to get pretty hot, but how hot is that? Well, we're going to have to make more assumptions. Welcome to Sometimes Things in Engineering, and for all intents and purposes, this is for a YouTube video, not for real engineering, so we're winging it a little bit here. Here's a chart of steel and how hot it gets, okay? It has been proven in material science that even before you start to see color in steel, when you've heated it up to about 550 degrees Celsius, that it's actually got only 40% its structural integrity that it had at a normal kind of room temperature. So that means that you've lost the ability to carry load and the steel is expanding. We're getting dangerously near to the point where something's going to break and fail. And anyone who has ever fabricated something will tell you this. When you start bending steel, you're bending a steel pipe, a plate, whatever, you're using the torch to heat it up, you start getting some color, that steel's real easy to move around. And steel under that pressure is going to want to move very quickly. So we'll be conservative a little bit and say perhaps 600. The steel is glowing dull red. That's a little hotter than the 550. We've lost even more than the load carrying ability that we had. So we're less than 40%. We're down somewhere 30-35% the load carrying ability. With that pressure, we're starting to turn this thing into a steam trebuchet. So that means that we're going to set our target temp at 600 degrees. And this is again Celsius. So we need to know how long will it take the steel at 207 to go to 600 degrees Celsius. So it's going to be time based on the size and based on the heat of the fire. Now, a hot burning bituminous coal fire gets up to around 2500 Fahrenheit, which is about 1370 C. So we're going to assume that we've got that in the firebox. So we got good combustion. The throttle is stuck wide open at this point. The pin fell out. So the throttle's wide open. They're drafting the crap out of the fire. The fireman and the engineer are floating up and down in the air, trying not to swallow the cotter pin, which was very important for the function of the throttle. Just don't let the other pin back out, and you would have been fine. It's fine. Polar Express. So I don't think the fireman would have adjusted things. He would have just been having the fire go nuts, and that's that. This is a stoker-fired engine, the whole 9 yards. So we're going to assume hot fire, 1370 degrees Celsius. So we need to know, with the size of firebox we have, with the size of crown, how long would it take with this much heat input to go from 207 to 600 C? Heat transfer was one of my least favorite college courses that I ever took, and here we are, and I'm doing it for YouTube. What is wrong? Thankfully, this is a rather simple part of heat transfer, and it is just a convective heat transfer equation. So that is defined as Q, which is our heat per unit time, so watts, how much heat per second we're pumping into this thing. And that is equal to a coefficient, which is going to be the fun one to figure out, times the area, times the delta in temperature. So we know our delta in temperature is 407 Celsius. We know our area there. We just need to figure out what coefficient to use, and we can figure out how much energy and heat per second we are pumping into the steel. Okay, so after like a good 30 minutes of like the literal math equations floating around my head thing of me trying to remember heat transfer things, because this is a YouTube video and it's just for the funny, we're gonna do the typical engineering thing and go to engineeringtoolbox.com and figure out which one of these makes the most sense. And I guess technically in this application, we are at gases at high pressure inside and outside tubes. Sure. And so that means that our heat transfer coefficient is somewhere between 150 and 500 watts per meter squared Kelvin. And thank God that the difference in Celsius is the same as the difference in Kelvin, because I forgot to change our temperature to Kelvin. It's fine. We're going to go with 500. We're going to go with the big one. And go from there. 500, how's that sound? So our rate of heat transfer, 500 times 8.4 times our difference in temperature there, is 1.65 million watts. It's a firebox. What did you expect? That's a lot. So that's, that's 1.6 megawatts. That's some crazy combustion stuff there, and that number is probably not exactly right, but that's okay. Oh, that's not our temperature difference. That's the temperature we want to get to. Oh, right. Okay, the actual number is it's a big boy. It's 4884 600. So almost 5 megawatts, which is, that's a lot. That's a lot of heat. And now we can figure out how quickly that'll take to heat up the steel and make the thing. Okay, doing more, remembering things from like 10 years ago. It's fine. Our specific heat, C, sorry for the math lesson today. Hopefully it'll be useful and or PTSD triggering for some of you, is equal to Q, that heat that we just figured out, which is our energy add. And then we've got a mass times the delta temperature. So then we should be able to figure out some things and stuff in words with that. So that means we know that our heat has got to be equal to the specific heat times the mass times the delta temperature. The specific heat of steel is 420 joules per kilogram degrees C, which is very helpful there. So 420, funny number, haha. The mass of steel is just going to be our area times a thickness, which I don't know on the Pure Marquette engines. 3/8 of an inch is usually a typical firebox diameter. Or thickness. So we're gonna use 3/8 of an inch converted to whatever that is in metric, and plug that in. Doing some math off screen, we end up with 74.77 kilograms. So that's, something like 200 pounds worth of steel in the crown. At that thickness, it's pretty thin. So There you go. And this time our delta temperature is the original one I tried to use, 600 minus 207. And that's all degrees Celsius. And then if we divide by time on both sides, we can kind of figure out exactly what's going on here. I was not understanding, and I recognize why. This is little q. This q right here is the big Q, which is the total heat, not the heat per time. So we already have this divided by time, basically. So we need to just figure out what that delta T is. You ever get an answer and be like, I thought this made sense and my logic was good, and this seems a little wrong? Seems like it would heat pretty quick. We didn't take into account the fact that the steam is still technically cooling it on the other side until the steam superheats. Because I get the time required to heat as 1.27 seconds. That's really fast. It is really hot. It's pretty thin, but we are cooling on the other side. So we need to subtract that out, and then that'll make more sense. Okay, after more math hurts my brain and checking things with calculators, it turns out that the steam heating up on the back end is the big reason that the steel doesn't heat that fast, because steam, trying to superheat that steam, which is what the steel would be doing, it has a much higher specific heat, so it takes a lot more energy to heat that steam and superheat it than it does to heat up the steel, and that would slow things down considerably. So we're talking more on the order of something like 25 to 30 seconds with the full bore fire to get this thing heated up like that. So that's a little bit surprising that the steam adds so much resistance. That's, you know, you would have expected, oh yeah, metal's gotta take a while to heat up and it can get hot, but no, it's the steam that causes that. So now it's time to figure out just how long that locomotive's pointed downhill. So checking back the tape, there's 3 hills that make up Glacier Gulch. The first downhill lasts 10 seconds, the second one lasts about 13, and the third one about 11 seconds. And that even looks like there's a little bit of Hollywood magic slow-mo too. Which means that none of the hills were long enough for the water to stay off the crown for long enough to cause, even in the most egregious of assumed ways, for the crown to fail. Yes, exposing the crown sheet means eventual kaboom, but not that quickly, it would seem. And that is absolutely hilarious to me. When I set out to do this, I knew, 1, that the heat transfer would be challenging and I wouldn't remember it. Apologies. Hopefully it was vaguely correct. Shrug. And that 2, I had assumed that there was no way it wasn't going to blow up. Like, come on, what do you mean? So the fact that no, the Polar Express would not have blown up, it would have made it down Glacier Gulch just fine, assuming that it kept on the track and that the supports were strong enough to hold it, and all these other things, and that the bearings and the rods didn't melt along the way down. I digress. But I guess if you had Lionel Magnetraction, you had Santa's magical supports holding up the track, I guess it would have. They would have made it down Glacier Gulch just fine, especially if it just got a running gear job. The running gear job would now be toast, but I guess they would have made it, despite the plane having come out and being lost. Quite the funny result, and I hope you enjoyed it, even as math-heavy as it got. But the next video I want to do in this little mini-series is not math-heavy whatsoever. It's going to be very experimental in nature, and we're going to see whether or not the Polar Express could steer on the ice. I have a thought about this, and we're going to be able to test it a little bit. Not with a full-scale locomotive. Don't worry, I'm not taking 491 to a lake. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for watching, and please let me know down in the comments down below if there's any other fun myths from Polar Express you'd love to see me tackle in this little mini-series. Alright guys, as always, have a happy holidays, enjoy the Christmas season, and we'll catch you all next time.